just common sense.
So you had this one viral tweet, which I think was a very unique take from the manosphere that I am in a lot these days. You
Yeah,
said, people tell men to sample the buffet that is
right,
available to them. But you
right.
said you don't just get it out of your system, you actually get it into your system. Can you talk
Yes.
a little bit
Yeah.
about what you mean by that? I think that's a fascinating take.
Um, so so this is a hard topic for me to talk about, because I really went kind of crazy. Um, Probably when I hit about 21, when I went to college, when I went off to University of Florida, I really went just out of control, promiscuous,
Mm.
partying, things like that. Um, I think like with that thing with sex, um, what's the closest you can ever be to a human being? That, that is the closest you can ever be to a person, and uh, I don't think it's just a physical act. I feel it's like an emotional act, a spiritual act. Now that I've aged, looking back, it's just, there's so much more to that act than just physical. And back then, I had kind of regarded it as just a physical act. And it became so, just bland. The more partners I had, the more bland it became. It was just like holding hands. I mean,
Yeah.
sex became like holding a hand or kissing or something like that. It was just a conquest. It was just an act, to satisfy an adrenaline rush or a dopamine rush. And I really, the more I've read about it, the more I see you can really reprogram your brain if you have a lot of partners, um, to just crave that dopamine surge, and crave that adrenaline rush of that new partner. And I think as a young person looking back, man, you get to the end of your life, and I'm only in my 40s, my late 40s, but you get towards my age and older, you start looking back on your life thinking, if I only knew then what I know now, and that's one big thing with me is like I think I got addicted to that validation. I got addicted to the sex. I got addicted to the affirmation I was getting, from girls, and it kind of carried with me. It's hard to break that cycle, and it got to the point where I got married, had 3 kids. Then they say there's the 7-year itch, you get in a marriage,
Mm.
and I got the 7-year itch, and I blew up my marriage, and once it starts, it's a very slippery slope. And I don't attribute me, blowing up my marriage just to what, I did in my 20s, but I think a lot of my psyche and brain were programmed back then to just, it's no big deal, it's just a physical thing. It's just, just have as many partners as you want, and I racked up a lot of partners back then, and it just changed how I kind of looked at sex. It changed how I looked at that, and I firmly disagree with get it out of your system. Like because it you just like with a drug, just like with gambling, just like with alcohol. You Some people say party, 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 and drink as much as you want while you're in college. Do you know how many alcoholics are formed when they're in college?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you don't get that kind of stuff out of your system. You get it in your system. So, that was kind of my take on it.
I completely agree with you, and I find it to be a very refreshing thing to say and very, very honest. Um, I'm a lot of videos I make is about the manosphere,
Hmm.
just like the advice that they give young men. And a lot of times they'll say women can't engage in that behavior, but men should. And I think that if it's bad for women, it's most likely bad for men as well.
Yeah, what's the
Um,
difference? Do
yeah,
you think there's a gene in a man that makes them any different, in how they how their brains respond. There's no brain gene in a man that
Yeah,
says they're not going to be affected by this the same way.
totally.
Women are emotional and get emotional attachments, and men sometimes don't have that. But from a changing your brain makeup, from changing your dopamine, from changing your adrenaline need, there's no difference. There's no gene that's a differentiator between a man and a woman that says men aren't affected by that. They want take it from a man, 100% you will be. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and I think that there's this idea that that's the peak of masculinity is being able to do that. And so if you have
yeah,
the option to do that, you should do it because that's
yeah,
proof that you are the guy, the man, when in the long
yeah,
run, perhaps, it's not what's best for you, as you just
yeah, yeah,
described. So I
yeah.
think it's very
Ha-
admirable.
having three daughters really changed my perspective as well. I always think, man, I hope they don't end up with somebody like me, like how I was,
Mm,
back then. And, it just, having daughters kind of from a man's standpoint really changes, kind of how you look at casual sex, so to speak.
yeah. I just really appreciate you being honest with that.
Oh, yep.
So do you think another thing that I read a lot is that young men shouldn't get married? Do you think men should get married today?
The iPhone has made it so much easier to cheat. In today's society, like heck, back in the 80s and 90s, if you wanted to cheat, you had to like sneak to a hotel or something. I mean, now you can carry around a Rolodex in your pocket of apps and things like that. And, I don't know the answer to that question. Everybody has to answer that on their own. I don't want to give a blanket statement on something like that. I think before a person does get married, they need to examine themselves, like truly examine themselves and say, look, am I addicted to sleeping around? There's actually questionnaires, online to see if you're addicted to sex, or see if you're addicted to gambling or drug. If you have a big vice that is controlling you, I do not think you should get married. Just don't put your children through that, pain and that misery, of doing that, to them. I mean, probably one thing I will 100% remember on my deathbed is the day that my ex-wife and I told my three daughters, and this was years, I mean, they were like young at the time, told my three daughters that we were getting a divorce. My oldest started crying, then my
Oh.
middle started crying, and then my youngest started crying. My youngest was only like 5 at the time. She didn't she didn't know what she was crying about, but just because her two sisters were crying. And it's like, if you are super promiscuous in college and super promiscuous in your later 20s and 30s, I mean, why get married and put children through that kind of lifestyle or through that
Yeah.
that trauma, so it's an individual decision. If a person has an addiction, even if they don't want to call it an addiction, if they want to call it I'm a real man, because I'm doing all this, you're going to be in for a very rude awakening when the realities of marriage settle down, and you get over the honeymoon phase for the first year or two, and then the everyday life with that partner is there, whether you're straight or gay, like, I mean, you live with someone for multiple years, it gets sometimes mundane, and then sometimes those demons kind of start to rear their ugly heads, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So if a person has that, they either need to get help before they get married or just don't get married.